Examples of corporations that failed to understand the market. Example number 1, Kodak. Kodak was the Apple of its day. Everybody wanted to work at Kodak. It was the most innovative company of its time. And the reality was everybody that worked for Kodak had a great job. Kodak decided that they wanted to double down on the film market as digital technology was coming out. Kodak actually invented the first digital camera, but held it from releasing it to the market because they didn't want to put their film business out of the running and out of the market. They chose to hold that back, and that's when Sony came on to play, and Sony essentially took over everything when it came to digital photography. Now nobody thinks of great cameras when they think of Kodak. They think of a company that used to be around and used to do cool things. Number 2, Nokia. Everybody knows Nokia. The story is one of the main case studies of why corporations fail to innovate. Nokia actually started out in 1871 as a paper mill. They were a paper factory. And over years of innovating and understanding the different marketplaces that they were a part of, they eventually got into the telecom industry and hardware. One of the fascinating things about Nokia is at their peak, they were worth $70 billion. The early 2000s, 1 out of every 3 phones was a Nokia. In 2007, Steve Jobs unleashed the iPhone, which essentially put thousands upon thousands of people out of business. The goal these days is to understand your marketplace and continue to grow with them. What Nokia failed to actually meet expectations was that they needed to work on user experience and software, and they missed their chance. Number 3, Xerox. Xerox, for the longest time, was the phrase for doing a photocopy. When somebody said, I'm gonna go make a copy of something, they said, I'm gonna go Xerox it. Crazy when we think about it now. Xerox didn't understand that over time, people would actually start competing with them and eventually wedge them out on price. Unfortunately, Xerox didn't understand that digitalization of documents was coming down the pike. Nobody buys large Xerox machines in the ways that they used to back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Xerox now has a situation where they really need to figure out a new way to innovate within their marketplace or eventually die out. It's one of those really frustrating things that they didn't experience all of this fluctuation of revenue and then find a way to put new revenue into different markets. Number 4, Blockbuster. Blockbuster is a mainstay or a part of Americana as far as I'm concerned. Everybody had one of those weird little Blockbuster memberships. Here's the reality. Blockbuster had chances to acquire Redbox, and prior to Redbox, it was an opportunity galore to actually acquire Netflix, one of the highest, most rapid growth companies in recent memory. The reality is Redbox was worried about competing on its own business model with tangible stores and didn't want to give people a convenience factor of having things either mailed to them or streaming online. The market wasn't ready for that, but they weren't putting any revenue into exploring the concept of new business models. Now, nobody talks about Blockbuster as a place to go rent or go experience anything in the way of media. If you don't look at new revenue models, you will miss out in the long run. Number 5, Yahoo. Everybody knows of Yahoo because it's such a tragic story of what could have been. In 1998, Yahoo refused to buy Google for $1 million. Think about that. In 2002, Yahoo realized that it made a giant mistake and offered Google $3 million. And Google said, nah, if you give us $5 billion, we can talk. Yahoo said, no chance. In 2008, Microsoft offered Yahoo $40 billion. Yahoo said no. In 2016, Yahoo sold to Verizon for $4.6 billion, a far cry from what it would have gotten in past eras. If Yahoo actually got out of its own way and decided to acquire smart and interesting opportunities, they would have scaled so much faster. Number 6, Segway. Segways were all the rage when they first came out. Everybody thought the Segway was the new form of transportation. If you look at malls or inside of even schools, a lot of people were using Segways. Now there's still Segway tours within large metropolitan cities, but it's come a long way. The reality is that Segway was a new invention, a new theme on the marketplace that was supposed to rapidly change the market. Unfortunately, it wasn't adapted to the average consumer because they were priced extremely high. So only the most expensive, lavish people of our time could actually afford a Segway scooter. Number 7, IBM. In the 1960s, IBM was the first and only computer company that was actually producing computers at scale. Now they only focused on the corporate market. Those that could afford to use computing power were only the largest companies in the world, and they thought that was the future. Unfortunately, personal PCs, real at-home gameplay, was not within their future understanding of growth. They lost out big time on the marketplace because they refused to build cheaper computers that were able to be acquired, used, purchased by the every person. Nowadays, nobody thinks of really nice laptops or really nice PCs in general as built by IBM. Number 8, JCPenney. JCPenney used to be the department store to go to. Everybody knew about JCPenney. JCPenney is where you went to get everything from clothes to shoes to even in-house supplies, whether it was a nice new table or even power tools. Crazy. Unfortunately, JCPenney didn't realize that there was a huge marketplace building up called the internet, and unfortunately lost out on scaling on a digital platform that honestly was taken over by Amazon in the long run. The reality is one of the biggest numbers that came out of failure within JCPenney was the closing of over 100 stores within the span of a year, losing $985 million within 1 year of seeing Amazon rocket ship growth, essentially putting their marketplace to shame. The reality is big box stores are not performing the way that they used to. People don't want to necessarily go to a store when they can buy things online from the comfort of their home or on their phone. Number 9, Tyrac. Tyrac was a very niche store that was peppered all over the UK and part of Europe. The goal was, if you are a fancy business person and you need yourself a nice tie, you only go to Tyrac. They didn't understand that diversifying their product line would eventually get them in trouble or at least put them out of business. In the 80s, everybody wanted the cool fancy ties, but the goal was, with these guys, they wanted to take over the market. Unfortunately, a lot of other big box stores decided to also start selling ties at a discounted rate and eventually put these guys out of business. Number 10, Blackberry. Blackberry was all the rage in the late 90s and early 2000s. They're one of those phones that had all the buttons on the outside, but what they offered was really high-level encryption. This is what the president used when they had a Blackberry in their hand talking at press conferences. The reality is Blackberry was a great piece of hardware and really reliable from a security standpoint, but dog shit awful when it came to user experience. When you had the iPhone hit the market in 2007, it essentially put the Blackberry to shame because the Blackberry was only good for one thing, which was rapid texting, but not a user experience of surfing the internet, engaging on social media, and doing a million other things that nobody ever thought your phones would do. Blackberry isn't a thing anymore, nobody talks about it, and the reality is they had the opportunity to innovate within their marketplace and chose not to. Number 11, MySpace. One of the biggest failures in social marketing or social networks that has ever been. MySpace was the biggest social community in the early to mid 2000s. The goal was that this was a place where you could customize everything on your page, you could put a million things out there, you can connect with strangers, friends, before people ever did that on the internet. This was way before Facebook. In 2005, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg met with the founder of MySpace and offered him $75 million for a platform that was losing a ton of traction. And essentially MySpace said no. The reality is MySpace lost out because there was two different models that really worked well for Facebook. It was the exclusivity of only students can be a part of this network, so you don't have a bunch of other people coming in and making it weird, which is one thing. And the other was lack of customization, simplicity, and the view of a platform that allowed you to do only a few things, but very simplistically. Number 12, Sears. Sears was the go-to hardware store. At some point, I remember being a kid going to Sears and getting free donuts while looking at different things, different tools, all kinds of hardware stuff with my dad. The reality is Sears was the epitome of big box store. Unfortunately, as Amazon and some of these other online marketplaces came about, there was no place to go in and browse and shop. Nobody wanted that. And the reality was every Christmas where Black Friday, people went from the red into the black, Sears consistently lost money. Sears continues to now announce store closings on a regular basis. And unless they change their model and having something in the way of a more immersive experience in store, they're going to continue to lose traction. Number 13, Macys. Macys was the premium store within New York and then beyond throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and part of the early 2000s. There's a reason that during Thanksgiving there's the Macy's Day Parade. that might be Easter or Christmas, but shit, they do like 3 of them. The reality is Macy's are closing and going out of business at scale because they're gigantic real estate areas where nobody's actually going in and buying anything. A lot of people started going to Macy's in order to shop for new products only to go and buy them online later at Amazon. Macy's, JCPenney's, and Sears at this point are struggling to try to catch up to online marketplaces. And while they are learning from H&M and some of these fast fashion manufacturers, they're still losing out at scale because they have so much overhead with large, giant facilities and also, large stores. It's a thing. Number 14, Hitachi. Hitachi actually used to be a sister organization of Sony. The reality was this was a Japanese manufacturing firm that made all the latest cutting edge technology. They did cameras, they did laptops, they did personal massagers, they did everything, but unfortunately they couldn't find one area to excel at. Over time, Hitachi has lost major areas of the marketplace because they haven't found their footing. And the reality is nobody's talking about their new Hitachi plasma TV anymore. Nobody's talking about their Hitachi headphones. Unfortunately, they haven't doubled down on the newest technology and actually tried to excel at it. They try to do everything for too long, too much, and they're still trying to find their place in the market. Number 15, Polaroid. Polaroid cameras were all the rage in the 70s, 80s, and sometimes if you're a 90s kid, you might have remembered them. You shoot the camera and then a piece of physical film pops out. Now they've had a resurgence over a number of years as kind of a kitschy, fun thing where you can stick stickers up, but the reality is they lost major market share because they didn't decide to go into a digital technology. Unfortunately, Polaroid is nothing more than kind of a hipster trend that resurges every 5 to 10 years. Now it would be nice for them to look at some different revenue models, but the reality is Polaroids are old school and I don't think anybody's really looking at them as a future trend maker. Number 16, Toshiba. Toshiba was the manufacturer when it came to laptops. They were excelling across all fronts. They were a major competitor to Intel for their computer chips. These guys were cutting edge. Nothing was more, frankly, amazing than the new technology coming out of Toshiba. They made telephones, they made TVs, they made all kinds of devices. Unfortunately, they decided that they couldn't figure out what area to go in and excel at, so they started stripping off areas of their best performing markets. Nobody understands how bad that is until you actually look at your old Toshiba laptop. They stopped making them back in the late 2000s. Unfortunate, but that's the case. Toshiba doesn't even make chips anymore. They're still trying to figure out where to go within the marketplace, and who knows if they'll be around the next 5 to 10 years. Number 17, Radio Shack. Radio Shack started in the 1920s. They were one of the first electronic manufacturers / storefronts. They made their own products as a competitor to some of the biggest brands out there. And the reality was, when you needed speaker wire, when you needed a small electronic device, something in the way of maybe a radio or boombox, you went to Radio Shack. Radio Shack started missing out on a major part of the marketplace when they avoided not only the online stuff, but they avoided going big. You have Best Buy, Circuit City was in there for a little while. Large manufacturers and also really big spaces for people to go experience and see the technology that was coming out. Personal technology is now online, and by the way, most of the stuff that your cell phone does is essentially all the different products that Radio Shack was selling, whether it was personal PC or your phone or a radio. So it's unfortunately tragic, but a lot of these stores have gone the way of the dinosaur. Number 18, Motorola. Everybody that I know at some point had a flip phone, whether it was the Razr phone or just something that you ended up picking up and you could see who was calling on the outside. These were the phones that were relatively cheap to manufacture and ended up hitting everybody within the marketplace. The reality is that they didn't innovate over time. As soon as Apple's iPhone came out and Steve Jobs took the stage showing that people could swipe and do all these interesting things across their phone, Motorola was losing traction almost immediately. Nobody has a Motorola phone anymore, at least nobody that I know. So the reality is they're not a major player in the marketplace and they're still trying to figure out new ways to innovate, but they're still putting out products, which is still admirable. This is a retail favorite. This is Abercrombie Fitch. Abercrombie Fitch was this amazing force in the retail sector that charged over $50 at some point for shirts. Honestly, they were worn by kind of the cool kids, the preppy kids throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Unfortunately, this brand got into a lot of trouble through kind of an outspoken CEO, we'll say that. He said on tape, I would rather have my clothes burned than let poor people wear them, which is fucking ridiculous if you ask me. The other side of it was they couldn't compete with fast fashion. So the reality is if you're going to H&M and paying $9 for a shirt versus $50 for the same kind of thing that covers your torso, who's gonna win out over time? They couldn't keep up with the brands, and the reality is they went out of business. America Online. America Online was this really interesting idea, which was basically, in order to get online, you needed to get one of those free little CDs at the checkout counter of CVS or Giant or Safeway or Publix, wherever you go, and then you would pay a hourly or monthly cycle of online access, getting America Online. These guys didn't realize that America wasn't going to stay online using dial-up forever. Over time, they didn't realize that some of the more dangerous acquisitions that didn't pan out, like their merger with AOL Time Warner, that was a giant disaster, was a total mess. So what ends up happening to AOL is at their peak, they were worth $350 billion with a B. When they finally got sold, they got sold for $1.1 billion.
What?
That's a mess up if you ask me. Atari was one of the first at-home game systems that you could purchase. This was probably the first well-known game console, and also in some circles considered a home personal computer. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of great games for this system. So you had Pong, and everybody knows the moving boxes with the dot, yeah. That was like as good as it gets when it comes to video games. Unfortunately, Atari did a lot of development when it came to building the computing, the hardware system. What they didn't focus on was the actual software. The games themselves, were there narratives there? Was there a purpose to doing repetitive tasks?
Why do they make that if you can't even win? Then why am I playing?
And unfortunately, Atari continued to release just awful games that nobody wanted to play, and eventually Nintendo basically came over and took over the entire field. This is why you need to focus on good customer experience and also providing amazing products for your customers and people that want to buy your stuff. Circuit City. Circuit City was this phenomenal growth of a company that started out as a really small entity. The goal was to create what was ordinarily a small corner shop, the electronics store, the way that Radio Shack did it, and do it in a big box store. They were the first big box store in the US to really scale. Unfortunately, they started getting eaten up by all their competitors, not to mention Best Buy. Best Buy is also one that I'll go into in this series. Essentially what happened was they failed to see where they could actually capitalize on showrooming. Showrooming is where somebody goes into a store and starts saying, oh, that's cheaper online. You know what? I can get that way cheaper at the store down the road. And instead of doing price matching and scaling some of their other businesses that were in-home care, they decided to start shutting down stores and completely went out of business. Compaq. Compaq was one of the first most well-known computer brands for personal computers. They actually built a lot of computers for IBM back in the day, go figure. Unfortunately, they were competing in a market that was scaling so quickly. Everybody wanted the latest and the greatest.
We're doing the reveal. His name's Jack.
Computers at home. And so they were competing with Dell. And unfortunately, over time, Dell came out with better products and also cheaper products. And so if the difference is a few $100s at the retail, you're gonna end up going with a, dude, you're getting a Dell.
Dude, you're getting a Dell. Easy to buy, easy to own.
So unfortunately, they ended up selling off, and I consider it to be kind of a failure because, yeah, they got wedged out of the market by not continuing to innovate and giving people what they want. Better personal home computers, maybe even laptops. Concord. Concord was the airliner, the jet that could get you from New York to London in under 4 hours, which is pretty unreal when you think about it. Unfortunately, this didn't catch on for a number of reasons. There were two gigantic crashes that had no survivors that obviously gave people an uncomfortable feeling about flying in a Concorde. But the other side of it was these were extremely expensive to manufacture and the seats were wildly overpriced. Nobody really needs to shave off 4 hours from 8 hours going across the Atlantic because guess what? If you got Wi-Fi and movies, does it really make a difference for an extra $1,000? Maybe not. So unfortunately, these things never really got up to a manufacturing speed that would make sense to put them out at scale. Concord might not be dead, who knows? We might start seeing him again in the future.
I have a design for a plane.
You do?
DeLorean. Everybody knows a DeLorean because of Back to the Future. It's the Ferrari doors and the cool, sleek, metallic outside. These things actually became a collector's item, go figure. But this was actually the brainchild of an American entrepreneur that moved his factory over to Ireland. Go figure. What ended up happening was this was a Ford executive that had been running amazing businesses in his past and was killing it over at Ford and decided, I'm going to open up my own car manufacturer in Ireland. So the guy ran out of money.
What? No money?
And what he did was starting to try to find investors elsewhere. He got a huge infusion of investment from the Irish government, which was nice, and actually then got investors to throw in and just didn't give the money back to the Irish investors. He also got into some trouble with some drug lords. It's this whole crazy story. Look up the story of DeLorean, you'll absolutely love it. Enron. Enron is the poster child for basically screwing over all the investors. So cooking the books, if you will.
Sound fair enough?
Enron had a problem internally, which was basically everybody was on the inside loop of screwing over everybody else. There are amazing documentaries already made about Enron. I highly recommend these because it's so prevalent within an organization where people are misleading their investors. Over time, the news came out that basically they had built a Ponzi scheme of no real investments that weren't scaling to the degree that they had promised.
So that was a fucking lie.
Enron filed for bankruptcy and a lot of people got in some big trouble. I highly recommend looking up the Enron documentary because there's so many great moments in that where you realize, like, how are people allowed to get away with this and not as many people went to jail as probably should have. General Motors. General Motors was the American Motor Company. This was where everybody wanted to work. This was the greatest automobile manufacturer, maybe aside from Ford, but it was a great place to work. And the reality was they were doing an amazing job up until the 70s hit, where basically all shit buckets that came out of the factory broke down within the first month. What they stopped to realize what they needed to do was innovate internally, find new and interesting ways to optimize some of the building processes, make sure that the employees were happy. There's instances of one individual worker purposely doing their job wrong to make sure that every car that came off the line was broken. And this happened at scale. So one of the more interesting things that happened was GM partnered with Toyota in order to actually have a swap of services and figure out what they could do better. There's a fascinating documentary about it, but I ran out of time. Google Glass. Google Glass was this really strange phenomenon that picked up during the mid-2000s. These were things that people wore on their face, covered part of their eye. This was the beginning of AR, artificial reality. The unfortunate part of this is that they were wildly overpriced. This was $1,500.
We're gonna have 2 ice hot vented foam mountains with fat-free lithium milk.
Great, that'll be $49.95 and a slap across the face.
To essentially have a camera that had minimal functionality and couldn't get wet. So if you were one of the use cases, let's say a gym, that wanted you to have a personal trainer that could watch and work with you during your workout, if you got any sweat into the device, it shut down and broke. Unfortunately, these devices also were worn out in public and people are like, dude, are you serious? Are you fucking filming me right now? There were so many instances of people getting into bar fights wearing Google Glass, go figure. It didn't scale and maybe on the next iteration, who knows? Hostess. Hostess makes Twinkies. Twinkies are kind of an American staple of junk food. They don't really taste that great, to be totally honest. And it's sacrilege saying it now because Hostess had announced a few years back that they would be stopping all production of the Twinkie because nobody was eating it. And all of a sudden Twinkie became this really amazing surge within social media where everybody was buying it up and people wanted to get Twinkies back into their life. Ultimately, it actually led to a major acquisition and people started buying Twinkies again.
Twinkies! They're bad!
Unfortunately, they didn't innovate in the way that they saw health food becoming a major part of kind of the diet of Americans.
Just try a little taste.
And also How can we continue to change products and make them more interesting to the consumer? Never gave it a shot. Hummer was this amazing force that came into the zeitgeist of everybody within kind of the 90s and 2000s. These were gas-guzzling Goliath vehicles that were kind of billed as like, you know, the man's man automobile. Unfortunately, due to the energy crisis that took place during the early 2000s, nobody really wanted to drive something that was burning up $5 in gas within the span of about 20 minutes. Unfortunately, this was also placated on Arnold Schwarzenegger driving a Hummer and making it into almost a laughable automobile for the everyman or every person to drive. These products were falling out of favor so fast, there wasn't anything that Hummer could do to really pull back the way that politics had kind of wrapped around this idea of unsustainable cars and automobiles that were just burning fossil fuels. The reality is these vehicles were never meant to be a staple of the American diet, but here we are. Hummer, not the greatest company ever to grace the earth. Mapquest. Mapquest was the first navigation tool that everybody used at scale. This is way before Waze, this is way before Google Maps. Everybody needed a way to go from one place to another. Nobody's using maps these days, so people would print out directions and take them with them in the car. Novel idea when cell phones didn't have GPS. Unfortunately, as the market continued to mature, Mapquest never thought maybe there's a different way of serving up these directions, or maybe there's a chance that we should be partnering with some of the larger players like Google.
I'm thinking maybe you and I could partner up.
Mapquest is no longer really used for anything other than registering your local business or your brick and mortar store so that you might be able to get a couple of backlinks here and there. Unfortunately, if they had planned ahead, maybe they would have considered teaming up with a large organization that does navigation. National Geographic. Now, National Geographic was this really interesting magazine. They were one of the first magazines to expose the world to all kinds of new cultures, new sources of wilderness, and crazy visuals. These were magazines that everybody can recognize by the yellow cover, and they were worldwide. Everybody loved National Geographic. It's where I saw my first nudity. But the reality is National Geographic wasn't keeping up with the marketplace. They created Nat Geo, which was a step in the right direction, but realistically, their magazine died out.
Ah! The mouse's ghostly howl stakes claim to
Nobody's buying National Geographic these days, and maybe you'll find it in the dentist waiting room, but the reality is they couldn't find new mediums to expose this really great content to a new audience or a new medium and platform to keep people engaged with what's going on. Netscape. Netscape was this really awesome browser and had a crazy little logo in the corner when it was loading. A lot of universities and smaller schools actually use Netscape as their go-to browser. Unfortunately, over time, Internet Explorer really took over the market. Netscape really never put a lot of time and energy into trying to figure out how to reduce some of the privacy concerns.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a straight yes or no. Can anyone see those pictures I sent to my intern?
How to make sure that websites that were malicious or nefarious weren't getting filtered through and giving people a lot of spam bots and all these other things. The reality is this was a great first browser. Most internet browsers were started using Netscape as kind of this foundation. Unfortunately, Netscape got acquired not too long ago by a company called Oath, essentially trying to do something new with the browser, and we'll see what happens, but it, for a very brief period of time, was the way to go. Nike Fuel Band. The Fuel Band was one of the really first amazing wearable devices that people could actually measure heart rate and get some biometric details to be able to, I don't know, run faster or measure their own times.
Run, Forrest, run! Run, Forrest!
The problem was this was well before Fitbit, and they hadn't worked out all the technology yet. There weren't supporting software or apps that allowed you to connect to your phone and be able to trace your entire route through, I guess, a drawing on your phone. The reality is, unfortunately, this was too early, and they couldn't get anything in the way of traction within the market because there weren't enough supporting software platforms to allow this really awesome piece of hardware to really hit the market in a big way. Nike ended up laying off the entire department as soon as they realized their mistake, and nobody wears a Nike Fuel Band anymore. Nortel. Nortel was a major telecom giant. that was scaling across all areas of the United States. This was a major East Coast player in most of internet traffic. Actually, at one point, 90% came through the Dulles corridor. Go figure. Nortel actually got in a lot of trouble by, let's say, misstating their financials, allegedly. They ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2009.
I declare bankruptcy!
Very similar to Enron, a lot of misgivings on what was actually happening behind the scenes in order to show something in the way of profits in order to continue to grow. Sometimes we really can't outweigh or outjump our own ambitions. And this was a perfect example of it. Pets.com. Pets.com probably is memorable because it had the little dog and the microphone. They actually had a pretty good marketing scheme, to be totally honest. Unfortunately, this company was the poster child for failures during the dot-com boom. So these guys received $300 million in funding.
And it's gone.
In order to scale the delivery of pet services and products. Doesn't really make any sense, and this is what unfortunately happens when a bubble gets too big within the tech community. Sometimes people don't actually need your products, or the service isn't that great. So Pets.com had this amazing concept. They had Super Bowl commercials, and unfortunately people weren't buying. And especially when the economy sunk, nobody was buying pet products online because they had to pay for shipping. This was one of those really amazing products that maybe will take off down the road, but not right now. Sony Walkman. Everybody had a Sony Walkman, whether it was the CD player or the cool cassette player. Nowadays, the only people that actually own those are probably hipsters. Shout out to you. Unfortunately, this was one of those things that Sony realized way too late in the game that they needed to work on software.
Wake up. Yeah. Wake up. I said wake up!
The concept was when iPods came out via Apple, they took over the entire marketplace. And the functionality of having CDs or clunky cassette tapes obviously wasn't still a thing. When you have free downloadable music, who's to actually go out and buy CDs to start plugging them in? Even if you're burning them, it doesn't make any sense because you can load everything up so seamlessly onto small devices. MP3 players basically washed out everything that Walkman within Sony had produced, and eventually they were out of the market. The Daily. The Daily was a brainchild of Rupert Murdoch. This was supposed to be a purely online magazine that required paid subscriptions to digest or consume any of the content that they offered.
It's not free.
Now, unfortunately, this came a little too early in probably most people's experience with buying content or consuming content that they had to pay for. It wasn't scaling in the way that really made sense compared to some of the other online publishers that don't require you to pay in order to get all of the content. There's a number of different areas where they probably could have done a better job at scaling, and unfortunately, this was a major publisher that just never really got their chance to shine. The Sharper Image. The Sharper Image was that go-to store that had all the weird shit on the walls that you could go in and be like, oh, I do need a nail clipper made out of Formica and stainless steel.
Sugar-free gum. Oh, sugar-free gum, forget that.
Or I do need a personal massage chair that costs $8,000 and I can take home today.
It's not whipped cream? No. Oh, I don't need that. Oh.
Unfortunately, this place was all over the map when it came to figuring out what their customers wanted. They tried to bring technology kind of on a higher level than maybe a Radio Shack or a big box store like Best Buy. Unfortunately, they were going after the retail sector and didn't realize that a lot of people were buying all this stuff online.
People are afraid of technology. Technology!
They started lowering the amount of prices and different products that they were offering. Over time, they started lowering the amount of stores that they had. And now I think they're really struggling to keep up, and who knows how they're going to actually pivot in order to stay relevant. Tivo. Tivo was this really novel idea, which was basically, you don't like commercials?
The brand new Sneezy XL. Two brothers. It's just called Two Brothers.
Great, you don't have to see commercials. Imagine having some little person inside of your VCR and hitting record. This is what Tivo offered, and it caught on like wildfire. Within a few years of being launched, Tivo had a market share of 4.4 million people regularly Tivoing stuff. That's what we think of when we talk about DVR, basically recording your shows online. The interesting part about Tivo is that they were a feature, not necessarily a service. And as a lot of the large cable companies and content providers realize is that, hey, why don't we just offer the same service and put them out of business? Within the few years of having the real amazing peak, Netflix comes along and basically goes, yeah, we can do all this stuff too. Basically taking up all market share and putting these guys out of business. Tower Records. Tower Records was the go-to record shop, then it turned into the go-to cassette shop, then it turned into the CD shop. This was like everybody thought that their Tower Records was the only one in town. But the reality is they had stores all over the nation. Unfortunately, as Napster came onto the markets, which is basically the freest of free places to download music illegally.
What did I do? You know it's illegal, download copyrighted music.
Pay for music, never legally download.
These guys went out of business practically overnight. When you could burn CDs instead of paying $16, $17 a pop, there was no need to go to the record store anymore. And unfortunately, trying to pay for that type of really nice commodity didn't make any sense. So these businesses basically went bankrupt overnight, and unfortunately you don't really see a lot of large-scale record stores because, who's buying it? Toys R Us. Toys R Us was the go-to place when you were a kid to screw around, have fun, shit yourself in the aisles, but also find bicycles and all kinds of sporting equipment. As a kid, it was the kids' store of kids' stores.
Fun, 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 fun!
These were big box stores that you could go there and get lost in games and all these other amazing products. Unfortunately, as society evolved, so did the interests of kids, and it became a lot more technical when it was like, I want video games. And Toys R Us didn't realize that they were also being eaten up by other players in the market. They tried to actually team up with Amazon and essentially sell all their products on Amazon, thus essentially putting themselves out of the market even further. Toys R Us went into bankruptcy and is still trying to figure out how to come out with a more immersive store in general. We'll see how it works, but they sure messed up early on. The XFL. This was a brainchild of Vince McMahon. Yeah, that guy from the WWE.
Watch out, watch out, watch out, watch out!
So he decided that he wanted to create a new football league that would go and play during times that the NFL wasn't playing, which in theory actually sounds pretty good. When it first aired, it had 14 million viewers. By the last game of the season, it struggled to get 1.5 million viewers. Unfortunately, the way that the game was played, the characters that were playing the game were a little unsavory. These were people, as it was billed, were prison inmates or people with checkered past. I don't think that flies in #MeToo, but hey, who am I to say? Realistically, when the XFL came out in 2020, they had a pretty good start going, but due to COVID-19, the entire season was basically scrambled, and that was the end of it. My name's Taylor Ryan. I put out a ton of content. Like and subscribe. I run a growth hacking agency in Copenhagen, Denmark. Make sure to subscribe to see more of this stuff.